Well, good afternoon. I think in as much as we have virtually a full house, I'll go ahead and get us started. I'm Bob Hathaway. I have the honor and the pleasure of directing the Asia program here at the Woodrow Wilson Center. Since this event is being webcast around the world, and since, as hard as it may seem to believe, there may be some people elsewhere who don't know the Wilson Center, if you'll permit me just to say two sentences about the Woodrow Wilson Center. We are the nation's official memorial to the 28th President of the United States. We strive to serve as a bridge between the world of the scholar and the world of the policymaker. In other words, to commemorate both the scholarly depth and the public policy concerns of President Wilson. This event today is a joint project of the Asia program and the Cold War International History Project. Peter and I were talking briefly just a couple minutes ago, and he was marveling at the quantity and the quality of documents that the Cold War Project has unearthed, translated, and published, made available to scholars. You simply cannot do Cold War history without using the resources of the Cold War Project. So I'm delighted to be working with Christian Osterman and his team on this project today. The publication of Peter's new book, and indeed the timing of our event today could not be more appropriate. We are approaching the 10th anniversary of what has now become America's longest war. We have begun the process of drawing down American and other NATO troops from Afghanistan, though probably not as quickly as many Americans would like to see. One hears talk and speculation about tentative efforts to jumpstart a peace process, a negotiating process. I hope Peter or our other two speakers might have something to say about that further on in the afternoon. Most people would contend that success in Afghanistan is contingent upon support from Pakistan's eastern neighbor, Pakistan. Pakistan and Afghanistan, of course, have had a troubled relationship. The American relationship with Pakistan is equally tortured. Indeed, the last day or two has brought hints from Pakistan that it may withdraw many of its troops from the border regions separating Afghanistan and Pakistan. Only yesterday morning, President Karzai's half-brother was assassinated in Kandahar. So the war, singular, in Afghanistan is very much on our minds and very much an issue before all of us today. Today's speakers, all three of them, are superbly equipped to shed light on today's developments, but equally importantly, to place today's headlines into a historical and cultural context. This historical context, in particular, is badly needed. Americans are notoriously ahistorical, which is a polite way, I think, of saying that many of us are woefully ignorant of history. I would draw your attention to the title of Peter's book. It's not the war of Afghanistan, it's the wars, plural, of Afghanistan. This is not the first time that a great power has found itself stuck in an Afghan tar baby. Nor is it the first time the United States has found itself at war in Afghanistan. And without trying to co-opt Peter in any way, I suspect he'll tell us that until and unless we understand these earlier experiences, we really don't have much of a chance of disentangling ourselves from Afghanistan today with any measure of success. So that's what we're about, and it gives me great pleasure to welcome all of you and to shortly turn things over to my colleagues up here. Let me make just a couple of announcements. First of all, as many of you noticed, there are copies of Peter's new book for sale immediately outside the doorway up there. I encourage you to pick up at least one and preferably several copies. I have informed sources that tell me that Peter will stay here signing copies as long as you keep buying them. In order to facilitate that process, we will be hosting a reception, also immediately outside, at the conclusion of today's event. So what better opportunity do you have than drink a glass of wine and have a few nibbles and buy away, and then get Peter to sign away. I'd also very briefly like to mention that we have here over the next 2 weeks 2 other programs on similar topics that I would like to not only bring to your attention, but also to invite you to join us. A week from tomorrow, Thursday the 21st of July, the Wilson Center is hosting former Pakistan President Pervez Musharraf, who will be talking on the troubled state of the U.S.-Pakistan relationship. That's Thursday the 21st. And then on Wednesday the 27th, one of our former visiting scholars here, Riaz Muhammad Khan, who was a senior Pakistan diplomat, was served for several years as Pakistan's foreign secretary, was involved intimately in Afghan affairs for 20-plus years, and who has just published a book on Afghanistan and Pakistan. He will be speaking here on Wednesday the 27th. So I would invite you to return not once but twice in the next 2 weeks for these events. Okay, on to the business of the day. We'll hear first from Peter Tomsen. Peter is ambassador in residence at the University of Nebraska at Omaha. He has a long and distinguished career as an American diplomat. Spent much of his time handling Asian issues. He was posted, among other places, in China, in India, Thailand, in Vietnam, also in Russia, the Soviet Union, during the height of the Cold War. He was the first President Bush's special envoy on Afghanistan with the rank of ambassador right at the tail end in the immediate aftermath of what some of us will refer to as the first Afghan War. By that we really mean the first war in which the United States was involved in Afghanistan. Peter had that position between 1989 and 1992. He subsequently served also as the American ambassador to Armenia in the mid-1990s. Peter, we'll turn things over to you, and then I'll introduce our other speakers after you finish.
Thanks very much, Bob, for the introduction. Our friendship goes back, you were on Steve Solars' staff on the Hill, and I was special envoy. And Bob was reminding me that the first time we met was at Sig Harrison's dinner. We spent, of course, the evening talking about Afghanistan, our favorite topic, even today. I would add, too, to what Bob said about the Woodrow Wilson Center, that there's no institution, I think, in the Western world which has done more high-quality work, made a greater effort to delve into Pakistani and Afghan issues than the Woodrow Wilson Center. A book, I've never seen a better study Bob put out, a book on education in Pakistan was published a couple years ago, which I referred to and use as a source in my book. Bob, I want to thank you and the Woodrow Wilson Center staff, especially Allison Lyakoff, for organizing this event. I want to give special thanks to two distinguished ambassadors on my right, Omar Samad and also Dennis Kux, for being commentators at this function on the book, and to Writers Books, which is organizing the book event outside. And most of all, I want to thank all of you for coming through the rain on this afternoon to this session, this event to discuss the wars of Afghanistan. I'm going to limit my remarks on the book to 3 parts. First is why I wrote it. Second is a brief description of the book. And the third is my proposals for a way forward. To begin, I wrote the book for 2 basic reasons. One was out of concern for the national interest. After 9/11, the United States plunged into Afghanistan with really very little knowledge of the country and the environment, its tribal culture, its history. And I set out to fill that knowledge gap. It took me 8 years to do that. The first 3 years were spent in research and organization. I spent a lot of time here at the Cold War International History Project because about 30% of the book is devoted to the Soviet experience in Afghanistan, that particular war which Bob referred to. The knowledge gap, though, is still not filled. The U.S. military and State Department, other agencies have done a lot of work in training FSOs, Foreign Service officers, and our military in the languages of Afghanistan and also Pakistan, in the history and culture of the country. However, the situation is so complex in Afghanistan. It's a mosaic, true mosaic, unique mosaic in the world of tribes, ethnic groups, and religions. And Pakistan is also a complicated country, and you really have to look at Afghanistan in the context of its neighbor Pakistan, not to mention Iran and other neighbors. The value of this book is not so much in the last chapter, which a lot of people will turn to right away, in which I give my proposals for the way ahead in Afghanistan in the months and years ahead, and also on Pakistan, the way ahead in dealing with Pakistan to get out of the mire, which Bob quite aptly referred to, in which we find ourselves today. The value is how we got here, how we got to this point, and why we arrived here. What were the mistakes we made in the last 30 years? The book focuses on all of these mistakes, and the last chapter attempts to climb out of the Afghan political cauldron in which we have found ourselves in now, like others have previously, and how to go forward. The other important reason was, like all of you here today, and like Afghans and Pakistanis, Americans in general, the international community, to break the cycle of wars in Afghanistan, because it is a recurring cycle, and the wars will continue because of the pressures generated from the outside through their surrogates inside Afghanistan, and because of the situation inside Afghanistan, unless there is a general agreement internally in the inner circle, that is inside Afghanistan, as well as outside Afghanistan, the outer circle of nations, and in other countries in the world, especially Saudi Arabia, and of course the United States, Europe, present-day actors in Afghanistan. Now to the second part of my remarks, a brief description of the book. The complications I've already touched on in writing about an issue like Afghanistan. The book project, I'm sorry, it just grew and grew. My publisher at the end said, you better not drop this book on your toe because you'll break it. And he was quite right. We started out in the contract with 125,000 words, and I asked if I could raise it to 160,000 words, and the publisher agreed. And after that, whenever I asked for more space, my editor, who was excellent, Lindsay Jones, and the publisher, Peter Osnos. They just gave up, actually. They just said, go ahead, go as far as you want. So I added 2 Arab chapters because it's so important to connect the dots with the events in the Arab Peninsula, also in the last 30 years, beginning with the Grand Mosque uprising in 1979, which is explained in depth in one of the 2 separate chapters now on the Arab world in the book. These 2 chapters also describe the religious ferment in the Arab world, the rise of the Muslim Brotherhood, which is a non-state actor but very important and active in just about every Arab country. Also, after the Grand Mosque uprising, the radical Wahhabi movement in Saudi Arabia, especially in the clerical establishment, and how the royal family tried to contain it to stay in power and to propitiate it by funding charities in the clerical establishment and allowing those charities to move abroad with support from petrodollars, not only the Saudi government, but also from the clerical establishment and also businessmen. And what emerged was a hybrid that sort of combined this radical Wahhabism, very virulent anti-Shia strain with it, and the Muslim Brotherhood revolutionary philosophy. This ideological wave poured into the frontier of Pakistan and at the time the military dictatorship in Pakistan, led by Zia Haq and his military intelligence organization, known by its acronym ISI, took that philosophy and attempted to use it to establish an infrastructure along the frontier of madrasas, training camps, mosques, and of course the charities, all of which had two wings. One was humanitarian or educational, and the other one was covert military. So this infrastructure grew over the years, this Islamist infrastructure, and became a platform for expanding the ideology into Afghanistan. And that's the situation we face today. The fire of this ideology, and also the jihadi highway, which goes into Afghanistan, sending fighters from this network into Afghanistan to fight the U.S.-led coalition and the Afghan government. Its origin is in Pakistan, and it's still out of Pakistan into Afghanistan, which is more of a which imbibes more of a moderate Islam, in a Sufi influenced Islam in its history. So aside from those 2 Arab chapters, I also last year asked the publisher to add 2 more. One on the Obama administration, because the book was taking so long and we were already halfway through the Obama administration. So the book actually ends in the spring of this year, so you'll be becoming basically up to date. In fact, my family and I were on vacation in Hawaii after finishing the book and handing it in, and it was going to the printers, and I got a call from Peter Osnos saying, Osama bin Laden has just been killed by U.S. Special Forces, so you have to add this to the book. And of course, that was very sensible, and I took a two-day break from the vacation and added that, and it's included inside the book. So in the end, the publisher also asked me, because it was such a complex topic, to add a cast of characters. So I drew up brief descriptions about 140 actors in the book of all nationalities, including non-state actors like Osama bin Laden and others. And in the end, the back matter and the front matter of the book added up to 180 pages, which is essentially the size of a small book. The structure of the book lies in 4 parts. It's divided into 4 parts. The first one is a platform for the other 3 parts. It explains in some detail the history and the culture of Afghanistan and the different religious groups in Afghanistan. There's a lot of maps, charts, tribes, of tribes and ethnic groups in that section. It also highlights the Afghan progression towards a increasingly modernizing state in the 20th century. It highlights the pride and honor qualities that are embedded in the Pashtunwali code. There's a joke among Afghans that the Afghans like to say that if you respect an Afghan, you can take him to hell. But if you don't respect an Afghan, you can't even take him to heaven. Let me repeat that because it's pretty funny. I thought that if you respect an Afghan, you can take him to hell. He'll follow you into hell. If you don't respect an Afghan, he won't follow you into heaven. Another quality is badal. This is a very important tenet and tradition of the Pashtunwali code, which is retribution for any slights to your honor or pride or to your family, and especially to your womenfolk. But there's a great deal of information in the chapter on tribe and mosque, which also goes into the Sufi religious strains, how it came into Afghanistan and mixed with the tribalism at the time, and then how the Wahhabi and Muslim Brotherhood forces came from the Arab world and their impact on the wars of Afghanistan in the last 30 years. On the historical side, the chapters discuss the creation of the Afghan state, the modern Afghan state in 1747, and its growth up to the communist coup in 1978, and then the Soviet invasion, which followed immediately thereafter almost. And the country plunged back into a shatter zone because of the invasion of the Soviet army and the great destruction and death it brought to Afghanistan. The second part of the book traces the period from the communist coup and the Soviet invasion up to the departure of the Soviet Union. The last chapter is entitled Zia's Vision, and it discusses in great depth and from several documents that have never seen the light of day yet, never been published, how Zia-ul-Haq and the ISI attempted to Islamicize not only Pakistan but Afghanistan, to create strategic depth in Afghanistan with a view towards, in the future, using Afghanistan and Afghan surrogates, radical Islamic Afghans, like Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, later the Taliban, as a springboard to spread Islamic extremism further into Central Asia and other areas of the world. The problem is that there was a corollary of this policy, which American policymakers did not see at the time. I didn't see it certainly at the beginning when I was involved, and that is that this volatile mix, this infrastructure that Zia-ul-Haq and the ISI created to export Islamic extremism, militant Islamic extremism, had a terrorism side, that the same camps that turned out fighters to go into Afghanistan and then later, after the Taliban ensconced themselves inside Afghanistan to other parts of the world, they were also exporting terrorism to other countries in the West, of course, in the Muslim world. Bombs began going off in Saudi Arabia. In the United States last year, Faisal Shahzad, he's the son of a Air Force general. He attempted to plant a bomb in Times Square. He was trained in North Waziristan inside this infrastructure, and he was assisted by one of the three major religio terrorist groups that ISI created during the Soviet and during and after the Soviet occupation. Jaish-e-Mohammed, and you've all probably heard of Lashkar-e-Taiba and Harakat-ul-Mujahideen, all created by the ISI to carry this proxy war, radical Islamist movement into Afghanistan, into other areas like Kashmir and further abroad. The third part of the book is my own time as special envoy. I take you along a journey that I followed, which I must say was quite difficult, and Grant Smith and others in the audience witness this. That actually Roy Gutman wrote a book, how we missed the story, in which he called it Mission Impossible, the assignment I was given, which was to bring basically to bring a political settlement to Afghanistan, which had been American policy since the Reagan administration and continued to be American policy into the Bush 41 administration. When I served, the objective was to bring about a political settlement in Afghanistan, to let the Afghans choose their own way, have an act of self-determination, either elections, help them get to an act of self-determination, either elections or a loya jirga. And that's what I set out to do. However, the Pakistani government was on quite another path, even though publicly they expressed support for this policy of a democratic path and a political settlement of the issue, let the Afghans themselves sort things out, stay away. Countries, if they're interested, can coordinate through the UN, which was attempting to assist the Afghans to organize this act of self-determination. On the contrary, covertly through the ISI, and after Zia's death also in 1988, the Pakistani General Staff continued to follow a military course. When the Soviets left Afghanistan, there's a chapter that Pakistan pivots. Pakistan pivoted into Afghanistan and attempted to overthrow the communist regime and install Gulbuddin Hekmatyar and a radical Islamic government inside Afghanistan. There, as this chapter explains, it was not only targeted this strategy against the communist regime in Kabul, but it also was targeted, perhaps even more, against the Mujahideen centers inside the country. Ahmad Shah Massoud, moderate Pashtuns in the east, like Abdul Haq, and a number of very powerful commanders, Haji Latif included in the south, who were anti-Islamists. They were against the puppets that the Pakistani ISI had created to take power in Kabul. They were moderate patriots who wanted to go back to what was an era of tranquility and modernizing Afghanistan at the time of the communist coup. So the ISI set about trying to strike at these centers. They included Ismail Khan, of course, in the west as well. And one by one, they were able to dismantle most of them. First, Ismail Khan was weakened quite considerably. Then there was a famous massacre of Massoud's commanders in the north that occurred on one of my trips to Pakistan. And the same tactic was occurring against the southern commanders and the eastern moderate commanders, Pashtun commanders. And it essentially worked. By the time that the communist regime fell, all of these different groups had been considerably weakened. Finally, we decided in Washington that we should go for negative symmetry. That is to say, the Soviets stopped their arms supplies, we stopped our arms supplies to the Mujahideen. This had been discussed when the Soviets pulled out, but we could not reach agreement. But the negotiations got going again in '91, and I was a participant in those negotiations. The KGB and the Soviet military they dragged their heels, and we did not finally consummate the agreement, sign it, until September 13th, 1991, where on January 1, we agreed to stop arms supplies to both sides. Within 5 months after that, the regime in Kabul had fallen. All of our intelligence community agreed that in the end, negative symmetry, whereby both superpowers stopped arms to the belligerents, would hurt both sides. It would hurt the communist side the most. They depended on outside aid the most. The Mujahideen had a much larger manpower pool, but they were fragmented, and they were not coordinating. They had been split, and they were already at loggerheads. So the fall of the regime set off a civil war in Afghanistan, which lasted right up till 9/11. Some state that this was a civil war along the lines, say, of the American Civil War, where we had regional differences and we had an internal clash. But I argue in the book that it was more like the Spanish Civil War, where you had outside great powers involved with their own proxies inside the country, and it was a much more complicated civil war. And that situation in Afghanistan has continued till today. You cannot stop the wars of Afghanistan unless you deal with both sides of the equation. One is the internal side, the other is the external side. The fourth part of the book, the last part, deals with the post 9/11 era up till the present, and it describes the many mistakes we made after we plunged into Afghanistan without really knowing the environment that we were in. And that also applies to members of the coalition that we were operating with. What occurred was that the ISI and the General Staff in Pakistan decided that they had better to defuse the war and pull as much as they could of the Taliban and Al-Qaeda remnants back to Pakistan, to their original sanctuaries, where they had been before the Soviet war. I explain in the book how, in fact, I met Taliban leaders when I was special envoy, and what ISI did with them in developing the Taliban was to take these mullahs who were semi-literate, like Mullah Omar and others, and put them into a shura, which they used to fight the communist regime in Kabul. After failing to put Gulbuddin Hekmatyar in power in Kabul, in 1994 they switched to the Taliban, these southern mullahs, and made them into a coherent organization, not, mind you, inside Pakistan. And I have maps in the book which show the 4 offensives that were launched during the 90s into Afghanistan from safe havens in Pakistan, sanctuaries in Pakistan, into Afghanistan to overthrow the Mujahideen regime in Kabul. Again, this was not a civil war. It was more like the Spanish Civil War, where outsiders were calling a lot of the shots. Eventually, with Pakistani assistance, including a lot of Pakistani troops and even more Pakistani religious students, thousands and thousands of them that were trained in the madrasas, armed and sent into Afghanistan, plus 1 and later 2 Arab brigades that Osama bin Laden raised, the regime was overthrown. When Operation Enduring Freedom took place, the Americans invaded Afghanistan. A lot of the leadership, certainly almost all of the leadership of the Taliban and Al-Qaeda, plus thousands of their foot soldiers, were not defeated. They just retreated back to the sanctuaries inside Pakistan. And it took about 3 or 4 years for ISI to revamp them and to send them back into Afghanistan, even though Pervez Musharraf, who I wish was here today because we could discuss this, he announced that Pakistan was with the United States in the war on terror, and he was handsomely rewarded by billions of dollars of assistance. But his ISI, which from 2003 for 3 years was headed by the present army chief in Pakistan, General Kayani, he was busily organizing and re-equipping the Taliban to return to Pakistan or to Afghanistan from the sanctuaries in Afghanistan. And I have maps later on in the books in the post 9/11 period, which shows that those same four invasion routes have been used by the ISI and the Taliban after 9/11. And you've seen after 2005, you will see in these maps how they have expanded into Afghanistan. The major mistake the coalition made, the U.S. made at that time, was that they took on the war burden for themselves. They didn't rely on Afghans. 7 months before 9/11, Massoud told the press conference in Europe that Afghans don't want foreign troops, we don't need foreign troops, we can defend our own land. And that was a position that Abdul Haq took before he was also assassinated by the Taliban, Massoud by al-Qaeda 2 days before 9/11. In October 2001, as the Americans were preparing to launch the attack into Afghanistan, Abdul Haq was telling the Western media that we should not have foreign ground forces in the war in Afghanistan. It will just screw up the tribal balances, and it will, in the end, it will be counterproductive. So now the Obama administration has finally announced, and it's because of our internal politics as well, the military and intelligence prongs of our government, who incidentally should be policy implementers mainly, but not policy makers as they have been during the George W. Bush administration and the first 2 years of the Obama administration. They deserve a seat at the policy-making table, but once policy is settled, they should be implementing that policy. Unfortunately, during my time and during the George W. Bush administration, first 2 years of the Obama administration, they have been dominating U.S. policy, and it's been more tactical than strategic. It's usually been looking at the military side and what's going to happen in the next 6 months, what should we do looking at the next fighting season in the next year. We really need a broad overlay, a broad strategic policy that looks not only at Afghanistan and Pakistan, but the region, and then implement that policy. And I go into that in the last chapter of the book. The last chapter of the book makes recommendations in 3 general areas. Because of the time factor, I'm just going to sum them up. The first area deals with Afghanistan, the second with Pakistan, the third with the regional and global dimension. In the first area on Afghanistan, in the book, I advocate not only Afghanistanization, which the administration is now following finally, but also de-Americanization. We still are calling all the shots in Afghanistan on the military side, on the economic side. I have a chart which shows American preeminence and Afghan dependence. And in that situation, you're never going to succeed in Afghanistan. Foreign armies have never succeeded in stabilizing Afghanistan. Only Afghans can do that. And right now, they're not doing it. We're saying we're moving towards that. We should have been there from the beginning, but we're still not de-Americanizing the war, and that should be a part of the Afghanization approach. On Pakistan, I urge a fundamental change in American policy towards Pakistan, that not only our stakes in Afghanistan are important here, but also the growth of global terrorism. That it's, even though there's problems now in Yemen and other parts of the Muslim world, the epicenter of radical Islamic terrorism still remains in northern Pakistan, in this infrastructure where Osama bin Laden was found and where his successor Ayman al-Zawahiri is hiding out. Our focus should still be on Pakistan changing course and genuinely cooperating in the war, in the struggle against Islamic extremism. And the ramifications are also extending now to the Arab Spring. It's very promising. However, it's also very volatile. And this area of the world in northern Pakistan is a threat to the Arab democratic movements that are underway in the Arab world. and it could drive them drive this trend in a radical direction, and it would come out of this area, this radical thrust, if it did. The final step that I advocate is regional and global reinforcement of the first two. The United States is so focused on the tactical, especially military and intelligence areas, that it doesn't look at the big long-term picture. We have tremendous influence, and we have great strengths on the diplomatic side, on the geostrategic side. That's what took us to victory in the Cold War. But we had a long-term plan. We had a long-term program. It lasted 40 years. We knew where we were going at the very beginning. Our military and intelligence assets were used and they were absolutely essential to reaching the final goal, which was the collapse of the Soviet Union. We have nowhere near that type of an approach on Afghanistan and Pakistan. I was very disappointed in the president's speech on downsizing in Afghanistan. It was all a bundle of tactics. There was nothing long-term at how we want the region to look. It was in, say, 10 years, 20 years' time, and how we're going to get there. It was an opportunity for him to do this. He didn't do that. His advisors didn't have him do that. So that wraps up what I would say. But I think it's time to move to the commentators, Bob.
All right, well, thank you very much, Peter. I think you've simply given us more reason to read the entire book. We'll now turn somewhat more briefly to two commentators. We'll hear first from Dennis Kux, who is a senior scholar here at the Wilson Center. Like Peter, Dennis had a long career in the U.S. Foreign Service. Like Peter, Dennis served as an American ambassador, in Dennis's case, to the Ivory Coast. Dennis also has the distinction, among other distinctions, of having authored what most people regard as the single best book on U.S.-Pakistan relations, as well as the single best book on U.S.-Indian relations. The first subtitled Disenchanted Allies, which unfortunately still true today. The India book, subtitled Estranged Democracies, which fortunately is no longer true. Dennis, turn things over to you.
Well, Bob, thank you very much. It's very nice that so many people have come to celebrate the publication of Peter's, the word in French is pavé, brick in English, and don't let it fall on your toes. And this is the soft cover version. This is minus 100 pages. It's actually, the text is just 714 pages. And perhaps it could have been cut, but I don't know. I think it is really an achievement, and I congratulate Peter on it. I think it should be a must-read for any American who deals with Afghanistan, for our diplomats, for our soldiers, for our aid people. If you want to understand what's happened in Afghanistan since the Soviets moved in Christmas Eve 1979, this is your book. And not just, and it's almost Tolstovian in scope, because Peter doesn't just tell the story of what happened in Afghanistan. He brings in these key external players, and he weaves them back and forth between Saudi Arabia, Russia, Pakistan, us, the Iranians, and of course, also the Afghans. And it's also a very personal book, because as Peter told you, he was the ambassador of the Mujahideen. And it's in a way, what would you call it? Not a bureaucratic tragedy, but it's a personal tragedy that the U.S. essentially, when the Russians left, we walked away from Afghanistan. And this becomes very clear in Peter's struggle to say, hey, let's really work towards a political settlement that the Afghans can accept, and let's stop franchising it or outsourcing our policy to Pakistan. But, you know, the world, if you think back, and I guess you have to say in defense of Bush 1, so many things were happening. The Berlin Wall, the Cold War ending, the New World, and Afghanistan just fell off the radar screen. It happened yesterday to run into our ambassador to Pakistan in the early 90s, who was there just after Peter left, John Monjo. And he said he used to, because we had no embassy in Kabul then. And it's ironic, we had an embassy in Kabul all through the Mujahideen period. And when Baker came in as Secretary of State, the very first day he took office, one of his acts was to shut the embassy in Kabul. And his concern was not big picture strategy and what have you. He was worried about there being trouble in Afghanistan and some American would be taken a hostage. And I think it was a big mistake. But let's talk about Peter's book. He really connects all the dots, to use that phrase. And it tells the tragedy, really, of how in these wars, first the Russians, and then the Pakistanis, through their proxies, the Taliban, occupied Afghanistan and failed and ruined the country. And now we are struggling not to occupy it, but to figure out a way to leave it in such a way that Afghanistan hopefully is restored to what Afghans think of as the golden age. That's the period of Zahir Shah before the 1979. Perhaps it wasn't so golden, but at least in comparison with the generation 30 years of hell that has followed, it was pretty good. So that's what our goal is, and I think Peter is very right in saying that the administration, and criticizing the administration for being tactical and for not looking ahead and figuring out a way as our goal to leave an Afghanistan that is, in effect, non-aligned in the modern sense of the word, neutral, and is, again, if you will, a buffer state. At peace, well, maybe not at peace with itself, because Afghans often aren't, but at least at peace with all its neighbors, and not a threat to all its neighbors so that they get sucked in their various conflicts. So I think the one thing in my comments, I think it's worthwhile to go back. Peter talks about 3 wars of Afghanistan. I'd like to talk very briefly about 6 wars, to include the 3 Anglo-Afghan wars, because they really, and it's interesting, you look at how each was handled, and it is indeed the British who I think were the most successful in dealing with Afghanistan. Now, the first 2 wars, remember 1839-41, the tremendous defeat that the British suffered, the worst they ever suffered initially, but they came back and they beat the Afghans, and then they were smart enough to do what? To get out. And so they set up Afghanistan essentially, as it wasn't really a protectorate, then as a buffer state. And this was the great game, protecting British India against the Russian incursions. And then you had the Second Afghan War, 1878 to 1880, in which the then Emir died and the successors. Afghanistan started to fall apart and the British got worried about the Russians. And again, they moved in, and at first they were defeated. And then they came back and they won. And again, when they were finished, they were smart enough, well, they abandoned what was called the forward policy, which is in a way what Pakistan adopted more recently and the Russians adopted, and they withdrew. And they established Afghanistan as a protectorate. And they left Afghanistan alone internally, and the Afghans agreed to really have no foreign policy, no dealings with foreign countries, and the British paid them a big subsidy and sent them arms for that. And that was really, this was Abdurrahman Khan from 1880 up until 1900, and it was really the start of he built the modern Afghan state. But the British, and then there was the Third Afghan War, which is the one that is not talked about very much. In that one, it wasn't the British who started the war, it was the Afghans. King Amanullah, 1919, chafing at the bit, and sensing that the British after World War I were in a weak position, attacked along in the northwest frontier, attacked across the disputed Durand Line, and the war came to a standstill. And as a result, the British granted Afghanistan its independence. And you had the two treaties of Rawalpindi with British India and Afghanistan, and then the Afghans said, that's not good enough. We want it with Great Britain, and in 1921 they got it. So then you had a period, this golden period, which in a way in terms of foreign affairs goes back further than just the Zahir Shah period. From 1919 up until 1978, Afghanistan was, in a sense, a buffer state. First between Soviet Russia and British India up until 1947. It was independent, but it was very careful. It didn't about its neighbors. And then from during the Cold War, from let's say 1948 up until 1978, between the communist Russia on the one side, Soviet Union, and between what you might call Pakistan / the US on the other side. And that was the era that today people look back. It was an era of peace. There was more or less calm inside Afghanistan, and friends who served there at the time said you'd roam all over the place, no trouble, very peaceful. Slow development because the rulers were very careful, very complicated society, highly centralized in one sense, but very decentralized in another. Very complicated society. But that ended in 1978, and the Russians stumbled in. As we now know, it was not, they really didn't want to take Afghanistan. They were worried about the communists. Communists staged a coup 2 years earlier, but they were very weak, very small party, and they set out to do two things that Eisenhower said don't do in Afghanistan when he was out there. He said two things move Afghans. One is religion and the other is nationalism. And the Russians and the communists offended them on both counts. And anyway, the Russians finally moved in Christmas 1979, overthrew one president, Hafizullah Amin, put somebody else in place. And then there was the reaction. Really, sort of in a way as Eisenhower, not that he predicted, but the Afghans were offended by the Russian presence, and they were offended by the attack on Islam, because the communist state, when Afghanistan, just tried to copy the Soviet model. And the Russians, in their period, and Peter brings this out very well, didn't understand Afghanistan. And they also used very rough military tactics, carpet bombing, burning villages, and so forth. And the result was, and that's interesting to contrast with, if you will, the American occupation. There were, 5 million refugees at the time? A large part of the population left. Well, what's happened since the Americans have come? I don't know whether it's 5 million, but 3 or 4 million have gone back. And so that, I think, speaks. People who say it's like the Russian, we're like the Russians, that's not right. We have been, maybe we've made a lot of mistakes, but we've been very careful on the way we fight to try to minimize civilian casualties. The Russians didn't. And also, the fact that Afghans have come back speaks for itself. And also the fact that even in the public opinion polls, we are not seen as occupiers. Because if you are seen as an occupier in Afghanistan, you're dead. And the Russians were dead. And anyway, so you move in, and Peter has described really what is, I call, that's the fourth war with the Russians, the fifth war, which I never really thought about in that way, is the Pakistan's effort through its proxies to gain control of Afghanistan, as the Russians did, well, not by directly occupying, and as the British did in a way, less forcefully. And that's the period from 92 to 2001. And first the Mujahideen fail, and then the Pakistanis latch on to the Taliban. And They, I would say, understood the Pakistanis because they were Pashtuns mostly, dealing with other Pashtuns, and understood the tribal dynamics, which are so important in Afghanistan, which the British understood, and which the Russians didn't understand, and which we only lately have come to understand or trying to understand. But the Taliban proved a terrible instrument because they were, what did Barney Rubin call them, as West Virginia hillbillies with Kalashnikovs. They were really obscurantists, and they were, the really only thing they cared about was their strict brand of Wahhabi Islam. They didn't know how to run the country. They allowed the Osama and others to come in. And the Pakistanis, in fact, found them difficult, proxies. Even so, the Pakistan stuck with them. And there were only, if you remember, there were only 3 countries that recognized them. And then came, well, they made the blunder of inviting Osama. And you had, well, it's just a syllable. Some of his critics think he's, anyway. So 9/11, and you have the 6th war. And I agree with Peter's analysis that Bush had a sort of so-so, well, not even so-so, a poor performance. It happened so quickly. In a sense, we weren't prepared for it, but that's understandable. And we didn't follow up on the opportunity because we were looking over towards Iraq. And also, Rumsfeld said, I remember at the time, his saying, the normal state of Afghanistan is anarchy, and we'll let it return to anarchy, which may be correct, but he didn't think about all the consequences. And so our effort there was underfunded, and I remember we went there, and Council on Foreign Relations did a study, and we went to Afghanistan in December 2003, and the Afghan National Army at the time, I think, had about 12 or 13,000 men in it. And we had a very radical recommendation in our report that they should jump it up to 27,000. Well, I think today, what are they talking about, 300,000 or something like that? So they were really, really underfunded, and there wasn't an awful lot of guidance coming out of Washington. People thought things were moving. There was a hope in Afghanistan because after this long nightmare, there was hope for the better, and the Afghans are not stupid at all. They knew that this was a great opportunity, that all this money was coming in, the world was helping them. And of course, that's another thing Peter and I were talking this morning that's different about the Russians and us. When the Russians moved in, the whole world was against them, except for the Soviet satellites. When we moved in, the whole world was with us. Well, who was not with us? Everybody was with us, really. That's another difference. Bush followed this, didn't really focus as much on Afghanistan, although they realized toward the end, okay, time please.
I was polite.
Yes, well, you are, but Robert, you're always polite.
Yeah.
Anyway, let me just say, I think we have changed. I'm a little more upbeat than Peter would be about Obama's effort. I think is focusing on the essentials. He's with the 3 T's: take it to the Taliban, train the Afghans, and transition out. And I think the things that Peter talked about will happen in terms of de-Americanizing the struggle, just in the nature of things. But what I worry about, and I think Peter is right about this, is whether we're thinking about broadly enough diplomatically about the need for not only an internal settlement, but for an external settlement, one in which all the countries around Pakistan, India, Russia, Iran, etc., and the stands agree to keep their hands off Afghanistan. Because if you don't have that, I am absolutely sure that a year after we leave in December 2014, you're going to have another civil war in Afghanistan. Peter proposes in his book that we copy the Congress of Vienna, where they established Belgium, the permanent neutrality of Belgium. I think that's a good idea, except I would pick Switzerland, not Belgium. And if I had my way, January 1, 2015, the 200th anniversary of the Congress of Vienna, there would be another meeting in Vienna to sign the Afghan Compact for Afghanistan's permanent neutrality and to guarantee its borders, and for Afghanistan, something we hadn't talked about, to recognize the Durand Line. Thank you.
Thanks, Dennis. We will now turn to Omar Samad. Omar Samad was, until last month, I believe, Afghanistan's ambassador to France. Prior to that, he served for 5 years as his country's ambassador to Canada. He was also, earlier in the previous decade, spokesperson for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, so he knows his way around the diplomatic arena, certainly. He was born in Kabul, but forced to flee his country following the communist coup in 1978. Settled and educated in part in the United States. Worked in a variety of areas, including and particularly, I think, journalism, and then returned to Afghanistan in 2002. So we welcome Ambassador Samad now.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much. Thank you to the Woodrow Wilson Center. My congratulations, Peter, on this accomplishment, major accomplishment. I am one of those people who was talking to you occasionally about how is it going, Peter, with the book, and you always said, well, I'm working on it, and kept on advancing, and so the expectation built up. And one day you gave us the good news that the book is done, gone to the editors, gone to the publishing, and then we received a copy of your book in Paris a few days ago. It actually happened to come to Paris a day before my wife's birthday, and she thought it was a big gift from somebody for her. I had to explain to her, and I said, the deal is you read it first, you tell me, then I'll read it. So anyway, it's a great accomplishment. I don't know how to add to what has already been said, because from an Afghan perspective, this book really gives an expose that fits our understanding of what happened to my country, what happened to us collectively, what happened to our region, especially since the communist takeover and Soviet occupation up to today. I don't want to spend too much time with the past, because I think there may be an interest also to talk about today and the road ahead. I want to talk a few minutes about current issues as well, which may be on people's mind. But just briefly to say that if you go back a few decades to Afghanistan's history and look at what may have happened and what went wrong and what could have probably changed the course of our history, you realize that since probably the post-World War II, there was an attempt by the Afghans to modernize. There were several attempts by the Afghans to modernize their society, their institutions, but post-World War II in the bipolar world that emerged, Afghanistan first went to the West and went to the United States to ask for being the partner to help us modernize. Unfortunately, the United States, especially in terms of our military, and the United States rebuffed Afghanistan's government at the time. And the Afghan government had no choice, or felt that they had no choice at the time, but to turn to the Soviets. And the Soviets opened their arms and embraced us and gave us lines of credit, took thousands of young Afghans for training in the Soviet Union. So that one incident, one decision, and I'm not going to go into details of why it might have been or or how the world looked at the time. Pakistan, Iran were very close to the United States, and Afghanistan probably didn't have much strategic value in the eyes of American policymakers back in the late 40s and early 50s. But that was a telling moment. Then the second event that also may have to some extent shaped us was this decade-long democratic experimentation that Afghanistan underwent between 1963 and 1973. Zahir Shah decided that he was going to change the political system from an absolute monarchy to a constitutional monarchy, unheard of in the Islamic world at the time, with a new constitution that gave Afghan men and women basic rights. Right to vote for a parliament, women voting in Afghanistan back in 1964, freedom of expression, and so on and so forth. That lasted for about a decade. So the country was impacted, but it was not very well received by the West. For whatever reason, again, there were many countries who thought that, what is Afghanistan to do with democracy? Why is this country trying to experiment with something that maybe it is not ready to absorb or understand? It's too tribal, it's too backward, and this is probably too advanced for the Afghans. Whereas, there are many other countries in the world that were probably also economically backward, underdeveloped, and so on and so forth, tribal as well, that have since then done very well with democracy. So Afghanistan back in the 60s and early 70s did not receive the kind of backing that it, I think, should have received in terms of developing civil societies, developing institutions, a democratic system. Then you have everything else that happened post-1978 with the communist takeover and the debacle after debacle, the crisis after crisis. And I don't want to go into that because already this has been talked about. But 2 points from the 80s that we need to remember, and I think Peter has done a wonderful job of explaining this in his book. One, it took a while for the Reagan administration to really decide that it was worth supporting. The Afghans were worth supporting. There was support, but the support grew over time. And while the decision was made to help the Afghans, Pakistan became the main partner. And it's through Pakistan that the aid flowed to the Afghans. So Pakistan became a very important and powerful decision maker in that process. And I think that this again is explained very well, that Pakistan had its own agenda. And unbeknownst to most of us, Afghans and Americans and many others, Pakistan was playing even then a double game. A double game of trying to tell all of us that we're on the same wavelength, we all aim for the same objectives, but on the surface it was doing what it needed to. Underlying all of that was the fact that it had a different agenda. And to this day, the Afghans think that that agenda is still at play. And this is what has brought us to this point. So could we have detected that? Could we have done something about it? Probably was probably easier to do something about it back then than it is today. But still, this is part of history now. Then we had another chance, I think. After the West disengaged and the Soviets withdrew from Afghanistan, the civil war ensued in my country. And eventually, by 1995-96, the Taliban took most of Afghanistan. The Afghans were absolutely felt abandoned. The Soviets had been defeated and so on and so forth, but the country was in shambles. There was no peace process. There was no political settlement. There was no economic reconstruction. There was nothing that happened post-Soviet withdrawal. And the countries that helped us during the Soviet period disengaged because the job was done and accomplished. And nobody knew that, again, there were other agendas at play, and that Afghanistan was going to become the hub for terrorism. Afghanistan was going to become the center for radical Islam and for launching those plans, not only inside Afghanistan, but also beyond. Again, the same scenario to some extent applies today and exists today. So Could we have done something at that point? And I know that Peter didn't mention this, but Peter played a very important role during that period of time. I, as an Afghan, was a witness to this, of trying to explain all of this to the American government, trying to explain it to anyone who would listen. Between 96 and 2001, before 9/11, the tragedies of 9/11, a few of us had a sense that something is awfully wrong, something happening in Afghanistan, in our region, while the Taliban are occupying the country, while Al-Qaeda is their main ally, while the structures and the infrastructure exist beyond our borders, and tens of thousands of young men are being trained to become militants and radicalized, there was no concern, not even a focus on the fact that this is and could become a major threat. So really nothing was done while a small group of Afghans were still fighting for whatever cause they believed in. And Massoud was the last man standing until he was assassinated on September 9th, 2001. There was very little, even though Osama bin Laden had made his statements. Osama bin Laden had called the United States enemy number one, was very clear on what he intended to do. The reaction was very slow and non-existent. So, of course, 9/11 became the wake-up call. So I just want to touch upon those as part of the record from an Afghan perspective. I'm willing to listen to other viewpoints on this, but from an Afghan perspective, I think this is how we see our history and our shared history now having evolved, and some key moments that may have been missed. Now, I want to take us, if you don't mind, I don't know how much time we have.
Another 5 minutes.
5 minutes, okay. I will try within the next 5 minutes, because I think we also want to probably entertain some discussion with the audience. But let me just say that we are right now, in my opinion, either in or entering a very challenging period on the Afghan mission. On the insurgency side, we have dealt a blow to the Taliban in southern Afghanistan, even though the president's brother was assassinated yesterday and things are fragile again in southern Afghanistan. We don't know if the vacuum that has been created is going to be filled, and by whom and how fast and how effective it might be. And we hope that we can fill that vacuum very quickly, regardless of what we think about individuals. But there was, of course, the president's brother had at least 10 years of experience and had become an effective administrator, regardless of all other things that may be said about him. So the insurgency continues to be bothersome, and they're using new tactics and trying to undermine what we are doing and trying to undermine the security and the stability that the country needs. It's also trying to undermine this outreach, this reconciliation package that we are working on, by saying that we have a door open for any insurgent who wants to come and lay down their arms and make peace and join the rest of the Afghans in a political context that would restore all their rights and give them certain, citizens' rights like all other Afghans. So it's going to, all of these threats and risks that are evolving are going to undermine what is happening. Then I see also a geopolitical realignment taking place right now as we speak. Pakistan has difficult relationships with the United States. The Chinese have their view, the Indians have their view, the Iranians, of course, have short-term interest and long-term interest, and we cannot get into all of this, but it's a very dynamic situation as we see it evolving. And then thirdly, I think that inside Afghanistan, there is some confusion and there's frustration. And I believe that what the Afghans would like to know and see is a clear path to the future. They want to know where we stand and where we want to go. I think it's important that the message that comes from the international community, whether it's the United States through a speech by President Obama or by the United Nations or anybody else, has to give us and your publics a strategic outlook on where we want to be in 10 years' time or 15 years' time, what kind of an Afghanistan we want to have, what kind of a region we want to build, so that every actor on the scene understands what the aspiration is and what we need to do and what elements need to be worked on in order for us to move forward. Right now, there is a sense of confusion, and I hope that we can work on this to clarify it. On the donor side, on the contributing side, on those who are involved in Afghanistan with troops and with money and resources, there is a sense of fatigue. There is a sense of there's also shrinking resources. You're facing economic issues, and that has created political pressure. So political pressure is translated into a quicker pullout from Afghanistan, not taking into account what the consequences might be or how to do it best. Is the issue just an issue of immediate withdrawal, or an issue of numbers, or is it an issue of how do we do this smartly in order to accomplish our objectives within a few years and consolidate the gains that we have attained in the past few years? I think that there are several areas where we have serious and real gains that need to be consolidated. I think that the Afghan people understand that they do not have an option other than the democratic path, other than pluralism. In the Afghan sense, there is always talk about we cannot turn Afghanistan into a Switzerland. Well, we never asked to become a Switzerland, and that's not our goal as Afghans. But we do want to build upon what was created back in the 1960s, is to build upon a democratic system that functions for the Afghans, and also would be acceptable, to the international community. This means strengthening civil society. This means strengthening those who are working on human rights, on gender issues. This means strengthening and nurturing those who have now opened space. The youth of Afghanistan, who make up 70% of the population and who are the future leaders of this country, who are yearning for freedom of expression. The Afghan youth in Kabul or Kandahar or Herat is no different than the Afghan youth in Egypt or Syria or somewhere else. But they're they're way more advanced than the others. The other Islamic countries are starting now to bring change, but we have had 10 years of an opportunity to rebuild ourselves. So we cannot let go of these gains, and we need to consolidate them. Even though we are talking about reconciliation with elements that do not believe in it, there are many many amongst the Taliban and those we call the Taliban who have no understanding or respect or belief in what I just mentioned. But they represent a minority in Afghanistan. And my view is that we need to stick with the majority in Afghanistan. There's a lot to be talked about. Maybe we'll have an opportunity to do so during the exchange. But what I want to say at the end is that The Wars of Afghanistan by Peter Tomsen provides a very strong basis and reference for not repeating the mistakes of the past and for learning from what has worked well and what has not worked in order to apply it to today's Afghanistan. Thank you.
Well, warm thanks to all three of our presentations for very rich and thoughtful comments, and comments which placed today in a broader context, which I think we can always use more of. I find myself facing something of a dilemma in that many of you, I'm sure, stimulated by what you've heard, would like to ask questions, and perhaps a number of you are also enticed by the thought of refreshments outside the door. I propose to recognize two people to ask questions now, and then we will adjourn and Peter, if I can put you in a spot, if we can ask if you'll be willing to stay around for a while, not only to sign books, but also to entertain additional questions, it'd be very good. So 2 questions now, one here and one there. Stephen, if you'll wait till the microphone gets to you, and if you'll introduce yourself and keep your question very short because we are already out of time.
Dan Lieberman. Yeah, you mentioned, the parliamentary process till 1973, but it seems that 1973 seems to be a key date when the constitutional monarchy was overthrown. I was wondering if you can explain.
63 to 73.
Yeah, but 73, the constitutional monarchy was overthrown when the king, I believe, was in Italy. I believe he was overthrown by his cousin, or why was it overthrown, and what happened from 73 to 79 that didn't allow at least the parliamentary process to continue?
Let's get the second question on the table at the same time.
My name is Stephen Shore. Given nature's well-known attitude toward vacuums, would any international guarantee of Afghanistan's permanent neutrality be any more long-lasting than the one given to Belgium?
Peter, why don't we start with you, and then we'll go straight down the line, and then each of the 3 speakers can come in on one or both of those questions.
That's right. Mohammed Daoud overthrew his first cousin and established a republic, which was certainly not a democratic republic, although he promised it would be, and it never was, and abolished the monarchy. And Zahir Shah was in Europe at the time traveling. So he remained in Europe until after 9/11, and eventually came back when the Americans went into Afghanistan. Daoud followed a policy which is described in some detail. I give a lot of attention to this in the book, of appealing to the left. And he established a working alliance, wasn't in writing, with the one wing of the Communist Party of Afghanistan, which was, of course, very close to the KGB. So he was playing with fire. He used the communist officers in the Afghan military and also in the Ministry of Internal Affairs, running the secret police. There were communists secretly embedded there that were attached to this wing of the Communist Party to overthrow Zahir Shah. After about 2 years, he began to purge those communists, but it was really too late by that time. In fact, his close coordination with the communists during this period, and even earlier, helped to bring down Afghanistan and bring down this 200-year-old monarchy or dynasty, which he continued in practice because he was also part of the ruling royal family. However, by swinging to the communist side and coordinated also, he met with Soviet KGB officers himself secretly during this period. Then trying to escape the tentacles of the KGB in the Soviet Union, it was too late, and the communist coup occurred. He did, though, try to break with the communists and move towards the West. Even he visited Pakistan a couple times, and he visited Iran and Saudi Arabia, but it was too late. And the communist coup took place, and the Soviet invasion took place as well. Do you want me to address the second one, too?
If you care to, or if you want to bucket down the line, that's all right, too.
Well, I'll just briefly comment. Of course, you're right. And my judgment is that it has to come at some point, because like during the period Dennis talked about, where you had a buffer arrangement and there was an informal agreement, in some ways in the St. Petersburg Treaty before World War I, it was a formal agreement whereby both the Russian Empire and the British Empire would practice restraint towards Afghanistan, treated as a buffer state generally. And both of them then coordinated their efforts against the rising power of Germany and Central Europe. The Soviet invasion broke that period of a buffer state, and Afghanistan descended into the shatter zone, and it's been there. It's been there until more recently. But Pakistan has to cooperate if we're going to get this type of arrangement of mutual restraint by the great powers around Afghanistan. Because if one attempts to establish its influence in Afghanistan, then others react, like the Russians, the Central Asian republics, and Iran, against Pakistan. So the war will just go into another cycle. My feeling is that the reason the surge that we launched in 2009, 2010 has not really worked is because we did not precede it with a tougher policy towards Pakistan. You see it coming now in the conditioning of military and economic assistance. In the last chapter of the book, I list 5 areas, including that one, where we should begin to show some steel to Pakistan, as we did during the Cold War to the Soviet Union, although they're not comparable. I mean, Pakistan still is sort of sweet and sour pork. It's a friend and some call it a friend enemy. They bring together friend and enemy. But certainly the military is following a policy which is endangering our own national interest in the short and long run, and we have to get tougher in dealing with Pakistan. If we would have had a tougher policy in place before the surge, I think we could have enjoyed a breakthrough like we did in Iraq. Now we could send 500,000 troops to Afghanistan, but as long as those jihadi highways are open, as they are today, a Marine major general last week told the Los Angeles Times that he's very dissatisfied that Pakistan has taken no effort to close the Taliban supply lines in from the Baluchistan area. That war will continue to tear Afghanistan no matter how many troops are there. So it's time for a tougher policy on Pakistan. We have to be very careful that there's not a backlash. We have to do this smartly. Under the surface in Pakistan, there still is civil society. There still is a firm desire for the return of civilian rule, parliamentary government. But it's still a military-dominated state, and the military dominates Pakistani politics in practice. The raid on Osama bin Laden's compound and his death has embarrassed the military, it's weakened the military, and maybe that will shake things up a bit and the civilian side can reassert itself more. And these forces underneath the surface that are there, and represent the majority of Pakistanis, I think, could come to as a potential to come to the surface. If that happens, the chances for peace in Afghanistan will be much greater.
Referring to your comment about Belgium, I think the reason that Belgium is a bad example and that Switzerland is a better example is that for 2 reasons. Number one, the Swiss were famous as fighters. Remember the Swiss Guard, well, even today, the Swiss Guards at the Vatican, the Swiss, they were mercenaries. And Switzerland, once it got its formal independence, was recognized, armed itself. And I think one of the reasons, if you remember, that Hitler and others kept their hands off Switzerland, they figured it wasn't worth the trouble. Because every Swiss at home, that had an arm, everybody was part of the army. And I think that there are parallels with Afghanistan. Gosh knows there's no country in the world that has better fighters than the Afghans. And I think if they're properly organized, properly armed, and here I sort of question trying to replicate an American-style army, properly organized to defend Afghanistan, they would pose quite a challenge, I think. That's one reason. The other reason is that Switzerland had some dispute over its borders, and Afghanistan does. And the Congress of Vienna recognized the borders of Switzerland, and they were accepted. Well, I think that an international agreement, should be a basis for Afghanistan's recognizing the Durand Line. Because while I dislike Pakistan's policies, et cetera, I think they have a grievance that the Afghans claim they have never accepted the border that was admittedly was imposed by the British in, I forget, 1893, but it's been there over 100 and some years. They still, if you remember, Afghanistan didn't recognize Pakistan, voted against its entry into the United Nations in 47. And then the Loya Jirga in 49 said, we don't recognize the Durand Line. So you get the crazy situation now where Afghanistan complains about Pakistanis or the Pashtuns moving across a border it doesn't recognize. And I think the Pakistanis have a legitimate grievance on that point. And if you talk to many Afghans, and maybe you could speak to this, every Afghan I've talked to says, oh no, we can't do it. It's too emotional, too hot an issue. Well, I don't think so, because the last time the Afghans were in Peshawar, when was it, 1826, 1827, something like that, when they were kicked out by the Sikhs. So I think this, well, anyway, it's a long answer to the thing that Switzerland is a better model and a feasible one.
Ambassador
Just
Samad.
briefly, on those two questions, President Daoud, former President Daoud, was a nationalist who happened to be a prince, member of royal family, who was an authoritarian person who did not really believe much in a democratic process, and very much focused on economic development and modernization, but also to some extent on doing the job himself. So all of those combined made him create an alliance with leftist elements, and as Peter said, he tried to remedy this during his presidency, wasn't able to. The other side had better intelligence and better organization, and so that was, by 78, the downfall of that regime. As far as neutrality is concerned, from an Afghan perspective, I think there are three elements that are key in order for this concept to be even envisaged and debated amongst Afghans. First, it has to have strong guarantees that could not be broken and could be sustained. Number two, it has to have the endorsement of the Afghan people by some mechanism that is legitimate and credible. And number three, it does require what we have been talking about, the shutdown of this infrastructure that has existed since the 1980s across our border. Unless there is an attempt made by our neighboring country to seriously tackle the issue of terrorism and extremism, and to start shutting down elements and bits and pieces of this infrastructure that exists, we are not going to be able to neutralize Afghanistan in the Belgian way or the Swiss way or any other way. Because that will always be there. If it still exists and we are talking about Afghan neutrality, it's not going to work. As far as the Duran line is concerned, of course, Afghans are, looking back at their own history, are emotional about it. But I have a feeling that they're also becoming more and more rational about it. What Afghans are looking for is a means at a certain point, once we feel political stability, security is strong enough in Afghanistan, at a certain point to raise this issue through an Afghan mechanism that will debate it. And I think that's a step forward.
Peter, I'm going to call upon you to say the last word, or almost the last word.
Oh, thanks, Bob. Let me just make a last substantive point that it is in the last chapter too, but I want to emphasize it, that many Afghans are not fed up, but they think it's time for foreign military forces to leave. The Afghan history is filled with examples of this idea among Afghans that they don't want armed, uniform foreign forces in their country for very long. And as Dennis said, the opinion polls show that they still, many of them still want the United States to stay. There's a good attitude towards the United States military. They've given a lot of assistance. But over time, staying for a longer term, they don't support that. I get that from anecdotal information. But at the same time that they want the military to go, they want America to stay. and that's the other side of the coin is extremely important. They want us to give development assistance, to give economic assistance, economic aid, and they want us as a hedge against Pakistan, because the United States is the only country that can really be a hedge against Pakistan. The problems in our country, though, are overwhelming now, and Congress and the American people want to downsize economic assistance. Next year might be half of what it is this year. The private sector is going to have to take up some of the slack, and we have some tremendous NGOs, very dedicated NGOs that have been working in Afghanistan for years, and I would just like to salute them and ask that you support them, people in this room, if you want to assist the stabilization process in Afghanistan, assist the Afghan people, to find an NGO, like for instance, Marie Kux in the front row runs a very effective NGO. It's the Nuristan Foundation, which is training women to work, giving them jobs, and also literacy courses for women and girls in different parts of the country. And there's many other good NGOs that are doing terrific work in Afghanistan. And I just like to make a request that you consider in the future, if you have an interest in Afghanistan, supporting the efforts of NGOs in the country. I also want to offer a vote of thanks to Bob Hathaway and his staff, again, Allison standing in the back, for holding this book event. All of us here at the table appreciate it, and I think people in the audience do as well. Thank you, Bob.
Well, the last word, thanks first of all to three terrific speakers. Thanks to Christian Nosterman and his team, and particularly Allison and Christina. And thanks to all of you. Now join us outside, and we are adjourned.